Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Um, I'm Owen O'Neill from Foras Feasa, and tonight I'm doing my first of what I hope to be a regular, once a week or once every 2 weeks at first, question time. Basically, questions and answers about Irish history. I hope everyone's fine. It's a lovely day down here in Kerry, in Valentia Island. Bit windy because there's a storm hitting, but fortunately it wasn't very strong, at least down here. I haven't had a chance to see the news, so I don't know how bad the storm has been elsewhere. But considering Storm Owen and other storms, it's been very gentle down here. So I hope some of you have been watching my channel over the last few years, and thank you very much for that. Um, Oh, thanks, Wayne. Thanks for the shout out. Enjoy your work, and I'll put this back up. I'll put this. I hope to go on for say 45 minutes an hour, and then I'll put it like a normal video, and you can watch then. So safe work and safe getting home. Thanks a lot. So I'm hoping to get this as a regular session, once every week, once every 2 weeks. Let's see what happens because sometimes work gets in the way and I just have too much work to do. As you may not know, for many, many years, as well as a historian, I was a translator. I worked with a lot of academic translations. AI got in the way in the last few years, but my work is suddenly booming. So on the one hand, I'm doing a lot of historical walks around South Kerry. And then on the other, I'm getting a lot of academic revisions to do. People translate with AI, etc., and then come to me to revise. Okay, it's money. It's money. Okay, so I'm. If anyone is watching and has a question, throw it into the chat and I'll see can I answer it. I'm a bit nervous about this sort of thing. Hope it goes well, but I'm starting. I took a few questions from questions that had been raised on my videos, things people had asked me quite a bit. The first is related to history and pseudo history. For some reason, I keep getting asked about this book. It's by a guy called Conor McDarry. It's called something like Irish Wisdom Preserved in the Bible and Pyramids. People keep asking me, have I read it? What do I think of it? I've read bits of it, and I don't think much of it at all. It's not history. It's pseudo history. The guy uses an Irish name, but he was American. He wrote, I think, at the beginning of the 20th century. He put on an Irish name. As far as I know, he was an American. I think he may have been of Irish descent, although he claims to, in the writing, you can say, he says this, the Irish for this is this. I actually had a look at it last night, and some of his Irish doesn't look very good to me, to be honest. I think he was also a Freemason. So basically what he's saying is fitting into sort of the Masonic idea of hidden knowledge, etc. But from a historical point of view, it's ridiculous. This idea of a lost civilization, of the Irish being the super civilization in the past, and their knowledge being being the basis of the pyramids, etc., etc. Yes, if you look at Irish history, for example, the Neolithic is older than the pyramids, but Egyptian civilization, I'm not an Egyptologist, but Egyptian civilization is very, 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 very old. And it goes back a lot before the pyramids. Ireland had a very interesting, a very strong, a unique in a way, culture, Neolithic culture, where they built the passage tombs, etc. Newgrange, Naut, Doubt, and other ones, I think Loch Crew. But it was nothing to do with the Egyptians. It was nothing to do with Atlantis. Um, then that's culture disappears, and then new people come in the Bronze Age, possibly the Beaker people eventually. I find the Bronze Age stuff very, very interesting. Um, which could be it's more most of it is at least 2,500, if not say 3,000 years old. If you go to the National Museum in Dublin, you can see these what you call it, not shelves, sort of display cabinets full of amazing tools, amazing weapons, shields, chains, rapiers, all from the Bronze Age and all looking very, very new. Bronze, I'm not a scientist. I never did many classes in chemistry, but bronze, I think, lasts much better than iron. Iron, if you leave it in a bog, if you leave it on the ground and you come back a few hundred years later, it will be all rusty and there won't be much left of it. So if you go upstairs in the National Museum in Ireland and have a look at some, say, swords from the Vikings, from the Norse, or even from Gaelic or Norman swords from the medieval period, most of them are, because they've been found in, especially the Gaelic swords with the distinctive open pommel that Hayes McCoy wrote about. Most of those are in very, very bad condition because they were found in rivers and they're all rusted. Whereas downstairs, you walk into the National Museum and turn immediately right, and you'll see a whole pile of stuff from the Bronze Age, and it looks perfect. So I find this Bronze Age culture very, very interesting. Um, from new DNA research and other research, it looks like that between Neolithic and Bronze, there was a change in the DNA. So there was probably a large number of people came into the country, bringing new culture, etc. Some people argue that it came down from some of the Scottish islands. I think the Shetlands or the Orkneys. That's what the Beaker people. Um, but the Bronze Age culture was very, very interesting. Locker, for example, then down here in Kerry, a bit to the east of me, you have this enormous number of stone circles, basically starting around Kenmare. There was one near Killarney, Beara, Doonbeg, etc. Not Doonbeg. There's another name. I made a video about it. There are loads and loads and loads of stone circles. Here they're standing stones. So, and eventually this Bronze Age culture changes, and you have the emergence of the Iron Age when the Gaelic people start emerging, when the Irish language emerges. Um, when the Irish language emerges is very, very debatable. I read the work of an academic, David Sifter, I think his name is. He's in Maynooth. He does a lot of work in Ogham and Old Irish and what's called Archaic Irish, though I know some people get annoyed with that word. And he has studied the changes in the Gaelic language. And these academics, I think they pushed the emergence of the Irish language, say 500 BC, maybe a couple of 100 years before. It's very hard to say because we don't have that much evidence. But what McDarry basically writes is completely ahistorical. So he rewrites Irish history, saying that in the past, in like basically going back to the time of Newgrange, etc., the Neolithic, you had this amazing culture, and he mixes in religion and stuff like that, and says that this provided the basis of the pyramids and also the Hebrew Bible. Again, it's just like if you go and read books, histories of how the Hebrew Bible was written. I know that Tom Holland writes a bit about that in his book, I think on the Persians. Like large parts of the Bible were written when most of the Jews or the Israelites, I'm not sure the best term for that, like 1000 BC, were had been brought to Babylon. A lot of the Bible written then. Um, it's nothing to do with Irish culture, whether it's Bronze Age culture, the Neolithic, or indeed the Gaelic system. So basically, I don't know anybody. I've seen a few channels that are history channels about our Irish history, and they give a lot of support to this. They seem to like this work, say there's something there. There's nothing there. It's a bad interpretation of history. It's a pseudo history. And I think Irish history, Gaelic history is fascinating. It's something very complex. But we also have to acknowledge that we don't know everything about it, and we never will. History is a puzzle. And with archaeology, with finds, with books, with sources, we put the bits of the puzzle together. We'll never complete it because humans are too complex. So I think Irish history is fascinating. When you invent stuff like this McDarry does, it's ruining it because it's producing this bad picture. He puts all pieces together that don't fit and then he claims something better. So I think something like McDarry's book is frankly ridiculous. And if I see people claiming that it's good, I don't know, I don't take them seriously. Sometimes you have to do that. The second question people have asked is about Queen Scotia. This is a myth. It's a very interesting myth. Basically, in the say mid medieval period, um, when it was very common in history, most countries were claiming, were inventing biblical pasts or classical pasts for themselves. The English produced this wonderful story that Brutus of Troy, he was a prince. I can't remember who he was the son of. I just accidentally closed my list of questions. So just one second. So they say Brutus of Troy, who somehow or other survived the Trojan War, he ended up in England. To me, this is a bad copy in a way of the Roman legend, whereby I think it was Aeneas, who was another survivor of Trojans. First of all, I think he ended up in Carthage, and then he went to Rome, went to Italy, and I'm not sure of the exact details, but he had a great hand in the founding of Rome. So therefore, the Romans were claiming to be um, basically descended from the Trojans. And they put in a dig against the Carthaginians at the same time. And the English did the same thing. They claimed Brutus had come to Troy, had come from Troy, ended up in England, and he was the first king of Britain or England. If you look at the works of Spenser in the 16th century, he uses this myth quite a lot. He also uses King Arthur and Brutus a bit to justify English dominion over Ireland. He says that King Arthur came over here and beat the Irish, and they all swore loyalty to them. So therefore, the Irish owed loyalty to the English. So I don't know whether Spencer actually believed this, whether he really believed that Brutus of Troy had existed, but it was used by the English to make themselves Romans, because they all knew this. I think it was Ovid who wrote a famous poem about Aeneas of Troy. So essentially, the English were saying, "Hey, we're not really the descendants of Saxons; we're really Romans." So they were really ultra civilized, why these Irish are not. So I think if you look around the origin legends of most of Europe in this early medieval period or middle medieval period, say 10th, 11th, 12th century, you'll find similar stories. and the Irish weren't going to be left out of it. So the monks, they dug around and they came up with, okay, let's get this lady, Scotia, so in some versions a daughter of the Pharaoh. Um, basically they're copying the story of Moses. And then you have the guy Mill, um, whose real name is Mill Espana, which is I think the monk who wrote that first was having a joke because he just copied down a Latin name and made it into a name. I think it's Miles Hispaniae, the no, the Latin for soldier of Spain. And this guy becomes the founder of the mythological dynasty that came to Ireland, mythological people who came to Ireland and became the Gaelic people. So if you, where I was actually studying about this recently, and most of this you find originally in Laura Gabal, the Book of Conquest, if you like, in a bad translation. But there are many versions of it, of the whole story. Some people, again, a bit like the pseudo history of this MacDarry, but it's less bad, I think. You have the whole story of the different people who came in. I think it was a granddaughter of Noah, then someone else, the Parthians, the Fomorians, the Tuatha De Danann, etc. You have this whole quite complex legend of various peoples coming to Ireland. Um, but I've forgotten what I was saying. You have this, and the final one are the Milesians, the Gaelic people. But the monks anchored this in the Bible, in the story of Moses, as I said. But I think by comparing the different versions and when they were written, we don't have the original, but we have copies of various ones. And looking at the language, scholars have been able to date when these stories may have come. So it appears that the story of the Milesians, no, sorry, the story of Scotia is one of the last parts of this. But as often happens, it's something that's stuck. Um, it was at the latest edition, but nowadays many people believe it because it's funny about Irish history. Um, History as an academic subject here really dates from the 19th century. In the late 18th century and 19th century, you have this powerful European movement, Romanticism, which has a huge impact in history all over the place, especially, say, Germany and England. In Germany, you have people like Herder, etc. And the idea that each nation, each people needs a nation, needs their own state, and they have their own history. Um, it's a simplification, a simplified looking at history. And so the idea that the nation, you owe loyalty to the nation rather than to local districts. Um, this had a huge, and then in Scotland there was that guy Macpherson with his work Ossianian. I don't know how you pronounce it, but basically Ossian, pronounced wrong and spelt wrong. Napoleon was a big fan of that. Basically, he took stories of the Fianna, moved them to Scotland, and kind of said they were poems he got off somebody when he wrote a lot of it himself, and it had a huge impact. Um, so a lot of the popular versions of Irish history, especially about Gaelic history, Gaelic prehistory, date from translations of Gaelic works, translations that were made in the 19th century. These are very problematic translations. Um, and there's a lot that hasn't been translated. They're problematic because Old Irish is difficult and not that many people study it. And there's a lot to translate. And we need urgently new translations which draw on new ideas, um, new concepts, and a better language. Because if you reading this stuff it can be hard because it's written in kind of 19th century language. The same as if you pick up Dickens, if you pick up 19th century writers, a lot of the English they use doesn't exist anymore. The same with that. So and also many people they read these stories translated, these histories, these legends, these myths. They read them in English, and they read them completely out of context. And like sort of there have been attempts to do an archaeology of them as such, to look at the stories of Cuchulainn and say, look at the weapons, look at the chariots, look at everything, and say how far back can we trace it? And they say, hold on, most of this stuff is medieval, early medieval. It doesn't seem to go back to the Iron Age. The stories may go back to the Iron Age, but it's complicated. So I love Irish mythology. I think it's very, very interesting. But we have to know that like some bits of Irish mythology are much newer, and we have to be careful. Sort of, I love the story of the Milesians because I live in Valencia. 20 minutes drive for me is Ballinaskellig's Bay, which, if you look at the work of Paddy Bush, he brought out a book recently which is brilliant on this, whose name escapes me now. And in Irish, Kenmare Bay, the Kenmare River, is called Inverscena, which is the Bay of Skena, the wife of Emergan who died. However, Paddy Bush argues that that's wrong. Inverscena should be the Ballinaskellig's Bay. And if you look, for example, at Ictakua, the stones of Ictakua, that's where Skena, the wife of Emergan, is supposed to be buried. And then there's two stone rows nearby as well, another stone row where one of the brothers of Emergan is buried. And in Waterville, there's stones like about 200 or 300 meters away from the beach. Carragena, the Rocks of Aina, another Emergan. On the Skelligs, in what they call the monk's graveyard, there's a stone there, another Milesian. So I think that Ballinaskellig's Bay is where the Milesians are supposed to arrive, if you look at the Song of Emergan and stuff like that. But I don't think there was an invasion of Gaelic people. It's getting harder and harder to support that hypothesis. DNA shows that there was a change between the Neolithic and Bronze Age, but since then there hasn't been that much change. There have some changes, like the Norse came in, English came in, etc., etc. But the last massive change was the Bronze Age. There wasn't a big change in the Iron Age. So I find a lot of that story very, very interesting, but not the part of what's her name, Scotia. It's something that's clearly added on. And there is a stone in Tralee. I know they investigated. The archaeologists went there and they said, "Nah, this is not very old. This is not interesting." So it's kind of something made up. And again, if you're looking at Irish history, you have to treat it seriously. You have to know when to differentiate mythology and history, and you have to treat mythology seriously. It offers wonderful insights into the Gaelic mind, but insights of the Gaelic mind, say maybe of the 16th century or the 5th century, they're historical sources, but they're not very good for some things that we want to know now. Just 1 second, and I'll move on to the next question. Hi, Dennis. Thanks for the question. Yeah, Trinity College has released thousands of historical records to mark the 103rd anniversary of the Four Courts Blaze. What impact do you think this could have? I think it could have an amazing impact, but it will be one that will be very, very slow to emerge. Academic history tends to work at a slower pace than, say, popular history, or even popular history can be very, very slow to change. Like if you look at research into Brian Boru, research into Growing Your Whale, research into anything, academic history changes slowly, but sometimes a popular picture remains, like the idea that Brian Boru drove away the Vikings in the at the Battle of Clontarf. No, he didn't. Were Vikings fighting on both sides, Norse fighting on both sides. Um, you could argue Brian Boru lost the battle because he was killed and his dynasty lost power. They would come back briefly, but it wasn't a victory. The king of Dublin, the Norse king of Dublin, Sitric, survived the battle because he stayed in Dublin, and he survived as king of Dublin. And after Clontarf, his power, like Dublin stayed powerful. It when the Normans invaded, they captured Dublin, and Dublin is really important. Then it becomes the capital of the English, the Norman, whatever you want to call it, state. In a way, Dublin was the winner of the Battle of Clontarf in the long term. So it changes. So these records, I think, they will be of use for history students, history researchers, but over a long term, they could be of great use to, because I don't know exactly what's in them, they could be of great use to local historians because, you might want to do research about a specific locality and there might be stuff there. Or you might find about a specific person. The first Duke of the first, sorry, Earl of Desmond, the Earl of Ormond, you might find some very good stuff there. At the same time, there are lots of Irish history stories. There's lots of documents. There's lots of archives. Um, there's not so many history students. History is important, but people sitting down and doing proper historical research, there's only a limited number of them because it's expensive to do, especially certain periods where stuff was destroyed. So you may like to do with the Irish Parliament, Grattan's Parliament, and Parliament in the 18th century. You have to go to London for a lot of the stuff. The internet it helps a lot now. There's so many electronic records, but sometimes you really have to see the old document in hand. But it's something that's very, very slow. But I think records like this are always important. I know that Trinity, a couple of years ago, they released some or made public records to do with 1641. And again, that's something will take years and years and years and years to go through. Because after 1641, the English had sort of they didn't call it a commission. They carried out an investigation which gathered a whole load of evidence. So, of course, 1641, the, the macro picture is basically wrong. There weren't hundreds of thousands of Protestants massacred. There were some massacres. There was massacres on both sides. But the records released by Trinity provide an insight. You can look in a micro, you can really drill down to local areas and find out what goes on. You'll have to treat each thing skeptically. You'll have to read them and say, who is this person speaking? Why is he speaking? How truthfully do I think he's speaking? The same with any historical record. History is never easy in a way. Easy history is bad history. But in short, I think that these records will be very, very good. I have a list of questions I've taken for anyone who's joined, from my YouTube videos, but feel free to ask away. And again, I want this to become something more regular. So if you can't think of anything today, I might do one next Monday or Tuesday. Ask them. Just one sec. Okay, the next question is about Brehon law. First of all, I think it's important to say that the term Brehon law is wrong. The scholars don't like it much because Brehon law, when the early Irish law is a better phrase, because Brehon law was invented, I think, in the 19th century. I'm not sure of the first use of it, but the term was coined well after Gaelic law, early Irish law, had been destroyed. Um, and in relation to the destruction of Gaelic law, there were a number of court cases taken in the early 17th century, uh, specifically against Taoiseach and succession and stuff like that. But there's an interesting book written by a guy called Hans Paulisch. I think that's how you pronounce his name. It's called something like Legal Imperialism. He looks at how the English used their own law against Gaelic law and how then they exported this to other countries they would conquer. It's a very interesting book. Um, but early Irish law, Gaelic law, is very, very interesting. Um, a very important point about it is it's not eternal. It wasn't all produced at a certain date. There was no code as such. If you look at Roman law, there were important codes. The Emperor Justinian produced a very, very important one. Probably was it the 5th century, the Justinian Code. Napoleon produced a very important law code, a French law code, and many countries actually copied that, especially, say, in South America. Um, Irish law, early Irish law, was produced over time. For example, there's a famous law, the law of Adwanon, Con Adwanon, as it's better known, or in Latin, Lex Innocentium, the law of the innocent. That dates to the end of the 7th century. We know that because it was produced in the context of a church. The church, various clerics came together and they produced this law, which was then how, again, leads to the next point, how was Brehon law, such early Irish law, implemented? It was in the hands of lawyers of Brehon, or Brehons, judges, not lawyers, sorry. But the problem of any system of law is how is it implemented, especially against the poorest people. Um, like Irish lords, Irish kings were always fighting each other. They were, if you look through the annals, it's raid and other raid and burning a church, burning this. Um, how could you punish a lord, a soldier, for killing an innocent person? It was difficult. Um, it was also a law. It wasn't a law that guaranteed equality to everybody. I see sometimes people talking about this early Irish law saying, "Oh, it was wonderful for women. It was everyone, it guaranteed rights, etc." You have to understand it was a product of a very hierarchical society. It's not like modern law where everybody theoretically is equal in the eyes of the law. In reality, money is important, it always has been. But in Gaelic law and early Irish law, your social status played a huge impact. Um, it was a hierarchical society. Most societies until, say, the 19th century were extreme, if not later, were extremely hierarchical. The people at the top would use religion, other ideologies to justify the law, to justify their being at the top and saying this is natural. In a way, you can see this in early Irish law. Um, I find it very interesting, though, because unlike English law, it was based more, or at least it seems to be based more on compensation than punishment. If you look at Ireland in the 17th century, when English law comes in, and the punishment for so many things is death, execution, uh, including, say, suicide. Uh, the English, if you look at the Elizabethans, they regarded the Gaelic Irish as savages, as, almost some of them almost they all thought the Gaelic Irish were subhuman, saying they had to be civilized, they had to be educated. And then part of this education was getting them used to the brutality of European law, English law. Like the a traitor was executed in a horrific way. Um, if you look at the works of Foucault, the French writer Foucault, he writes, I think it's called something and punish, law and punishment, something like that. Uh, he's writing about France, where in France and Italy, people would be broken on the wheel. You put on the wheel is spun around, and you're hit until you die. In England, they would castrate you, cut off your arms and legs, half hang you, cut you open, take out stuff like that. Um, Horrific punishments that were designed to show the power of the monarch, the power of the state, and that anybody who transgressed against the state would be severely punished. Um, that's not found in Gaelic law, in early Irish law. It's based on compensation. However, I don't think you can say that Brehon law brings equality, brings peace to the world, and stuff like that, as I've seen it said. Um, okay, just 1 second. I have another sip of my tea. Another question. Did Druids exist in Ireland? Oh, good evening, Mihal. Good evening, clans and dynasties. Ask a question you have, but not too hard a one. Did Druids exist in Ireland? It's an interesting question. It's one that you can say both yes and no to. Um, Someone with a religious role existed in Iron Age Ireland, in pre-Christian Ireland, obviously. If you look at, and you could say that someone with this role existed in Bronze Age Ireland, someone with this role existed in Neolithic Ireland. Oh, we have evidence going back thousands of years of the existence of rituals, the existence of sacredness. So, and it seems to be something inherent in humans, that religion, sacredness, a differentiation between the profane, the normal, and the religious. That seems to be something very human. So there must have been people in Gaelic Ireland, pre-Christian Ireland, who exercised the function of a religious slash political slash legal function. However, were they Druids? The question is, what is a Druid? Because the evidence we have for Druids normally comes from Roman writers, maybe some Greeks, but I think mainly Romans, such as Caesar and I think Pliny. Um, and they describe a specific form of political priesthood um, based in Gaul. A Gaul, which nowadays people say France, but it went into Belgium, probably parts of the Netherlands, and possibly Germany. My knowledge of the geography is not very good, and also Italy. And the evidence they talk about these Druids is somewhat contradictory. What they did, Caesar says, and so does Tacitus, talks about some of these Druids in England. But the evidence we have about Ireland is all post-Christian. All the written sources are post-Christian. They were written by Christian monks who were educated in, they knew the Bible and they had a good knowledge of Roman sources. Um, we like judge based on translations, we kind of know the translations of classical works that exists. Uh, for example, there's no translation as such of the Homer, but there's translations of Roman adaptations. So we know that the monks knew, they had knowledge of the the Roman concept, the Roman idea of druid, and they use the same word. But does that mean that the pagan, the pre-Christian priests in Ireland were druids in the same way as in Gaul or the same way as in Britain? I don't know, but I think it's too big of a jump to say yes. And the word druid can mean so many different things. Like to me, druid is like what's his name, Getafix and Asterix, the white robe, the sickle, mistletoe, etc. And as far as I know, for example, mistletoe is not native to Ireland. So there are major differences. And I think you have to be, for anyone who's involved in a pagan religion, something I find interesting, I just, you have to be very, very careful with your recreation of history and not to be taken in by a romanticized version of history, as happens too much. Okay, clans and dynasties. Oh, thank you very much for the gift. Um, so, what is your opinion on the idea the story of the Book of Invasions is an echo of actual historical migrations, or is a complete myth? I touched on this earlier, but I'll just come back. Um, I'm going to be bad and say both. It is a myth. Parts of it are completely invented, but, and I think nowadays as well, it seems that the Gaelic language emerged in Ireland. But if you dig deep down, before Gaelic Irish emerged out of an Indo-European language. You can use the word Celtic for that. I'm not sure whether it's used much at the moment. Probably. So going back, there is a root language, or root languages. So there were migrations. Um, but did the Gaelic Irish come from Spain, or did some of them, like, it doesn't appear that there was a complete there was no, so far there's no evidence of a complete change in Irish DNA at that time, but it is possible that a small group of people came in, and it is possible, it's, if you accept that a small group may have come in with new ideas, with iron, was it an invasion, was it a colonization? uh, Somewhere in the obvious place for them to arrive, especially if they're not coming through England, is South Munster, Cork and Kerry, possibly Waterford. Um, though, because those are the nearest to, say, Spain, to Portugal, to France. And it wasn't like the Romans, for example, thought that Ireland was in the Bay of Biscay. It's not, but like some of the Spanish ships in the 16th century, the Age of Sail, they could, depending on the weather, they could reach Ireland in a couple of weeks. So it, Ireland is not that far from Spain, from Lisbon, from Portugal, from France. The problem is the weather. But I think there may well have been, going back 500 BC, 600 BC, or even a bit before, there may well have been people who came from there. So there's a possibility that the Milesian invasion landing has some truth. Um, there's, and you could also say that this idea of a series of invasions, because there were very people would have reached Ireland at different times, and from my understanding, the the date of the first person, or the first settlers in Ireland after the Ice Age keeps moving back. Like I know in Ferreter's Cove in Kerry, near Ballyferreter, they found some very, very old stuff. I think they found the first cattle bones. So, and cattle were not native to Ireland. So somebody sailed across the Atlantic, Ireland's Atlantic coast, um, and landed in Kerry, bringing, they had cattle with them, probably a small cow, maybe even a calf. So there were various landings, various settlers coming in. Of course, it's mixed, like Fomorians, uh, the Tuatha Dan and the other ones, and some are Christianized. It's a big mix, but I think it's interesting, and I think people also forget the use that uh, Keating, Keating, made of this idea. I take the name from my channel, Foras Feasa, from Keating's work, Foras Feasa and the Heron, um, because he had this. He was Old English, although he was completely fluent in Ireland. He was from an Old English background. He was a priest, but he saw Irish history as a series of people coming into Ireland over time. Um, he saw himself as a historian, and in the first part of his book, he has a very interesting long introduction whereby he goes through, he attacks people like, I'm not sure about Spencer, but he attacks a long list of people for perfidies against Ireland, for saying bad things about Ireland and saying they're not good historians. Oh, thanks, Miho. Uh, Keating's Irish Fitzgerald branch. That I didn't know. I know he's from, was it Waterford, Tipperary, somewhere down there. Um, I support that the Gaelic language is native to Ireland and West. Yeah, yeah. So you're saying, you're agreeing with me saying that Irish seems to have emerged in Ireland and probably Scotland at the same time. Now, so Keating had this idea that a series of people comes in, and he takes the Book of Invasions, which is is it the granddaughter of Noah, then someone else, then the Fomorians, and the Tuatha Dan, and then the Milesians. But he doesn't stop. He mentions, I'm not sure if he includes the Norse, but he specifically mentions the Old English. So he includes them. So, and says that they came in and they became Irish because they were Catholic. Whereas he's writing against the newest English, or at least the latter part, who are Protestants. Because the first New English who came into Ireland, many of them became Catholic. Like Henry Bagnall, who is best known for being killed by Hugh O'Neill at the Battle of the Yellow Ford. His nephew was hung by the Cromwellians in 1651 or 1652. He fought for the Confederacy, the Confederacy of Kilkenny. And I think a descendant of his, or vague descendant, if you know the song Kelly the Boy from Killaan, it refers to Brave Harvey is in the van at the beginning of the song. That was Bagnall Harvey. And as far as I know, Bagnall Harvey is somehow descendant of the Bagnall family. So Keating had this idea of immigrants to Ireland being absorbed and becoming Irish, which is something very modern and something that many people have a difficulty in dealing with nowadays. Whereas he was writing this in the early 17th century. So in short, there could be some truth in the Book of Invasions, or it is a myth, but it was probably an attempt to make sense of a history they didn't fully know. Probably a series of stories came down, sometimes contradictory stories, and they wanted to deal with the question of who are we, where did we come from, but they wanted to answer that with a Christian answer, as I was saying earlier, and that's how this story, at least in the version it came to us, came about. Now, another question. Let's see, I think I have time for one more. Who was worse, Elizabeth or Cromwell? That's a question I've been thinking about quite a bit. And it's my question. I just threw it down in the list. It's funny because, thanks, Michael. I'm going to agree with you, but let me talk a bit first. Um, if you look at history, villains, everybody seems to love villains or hate villains, love to hate villains. Cromwell is one of the big villains in Irish history. Um, if you look at the story, moving back a little before, of the Battle of Kinsale, there is a story which is a complete and utter fabrication, probably started much later, saying, I think it was Brian McMahon, blaming him for giving the no problem, Michael, giving the plans for the Irish attack to the English for a bottle of whiskey. It was complete fabrication, but Brian McMahon was given, like, became a sort of villain in Irish history. Whereas Lord Holt, a few years later, who played a huge role in triggering the flight of the Earls, nobody says anything bad about him. All they say is, oh, that Granuaile visited there and kidnapped one of the guys. Da-da-da-da. He was an actual traitor, if you want to use that word. He was a double agent, and he played a big role in spooking O'Neill to trying to flee to Spain. Uh, it may be if he hadn't done that, there wouldn't have been the flight of Earls, and history would have been different. So, what gets remembered in history is sometimes not correct. The people we vilify is not correct. So, Cromwell is seen as this um, horrific figure. I don't think he was nice in England, in Scotland, or Ireland, but I think he's come to represent the total evilness of the English, whatever you like. And I think he's over vilified. He's become essentially a cartoon character. Whereas Elizabeth, and everybody's already agreeing with me, I'm jumping to the end. Yes, Elizabeth was much worse than Cromwell. Um, if you look, someone has actually studied the the number of executions under Elizabeth. They were massive, under her and her father, and I think under Mary, and I'm not sure about Edward. He didn't last very long. The Tudor society was very, very violent. It was violent against its own people. It was super violent against Ireland, in Ireland. Um, Famine was used as a weapon in the Munster Rebellion, in the Nine Years' War, and other times. If you read the state papers, read letters that English officials were writing, Mountjoy and Chichester, he's the worst, what they were writing at the time, they are horrific. They, like, Mountjoy says, oh, I had a battle against O'Neill and say 20 people were killed, but they're all Irish, so it doesn't matter. I love it when they kill each other. And I always thought about, Brendan Bradshaw wrote a very interesting article years ago, and he's talking about the English and the Old English to an extent had this idea that the Irish had to be civilized. The question was, by the pen or by the sword? By the 1590s, the English were using the sword. Um, it was a brutal time in Europe. Like, the 30 Years' War would start shortly afterwards, I think 1612 to 1648, or 1618 to 1648. That was a result in 30% of Germany dying. I think that's the general thing. Um, but Like under Cromwell, the population of Ireland fell massively, but that was in a large extent a result of what was it? So 10, 11 years of war. And at that stage, when an army marched around, what would follow the army was disease and famine. And you had armies marching up and down all over Ireland. Food was getting short, crops were getting plundered, cattle were getting killed. People were, it was a large number of years. Not trying to say Cromwell was a nice guy, he wasn't. Definitely wouldn't go for a beer with him. Um, but he's over vilified. Whereas for Elizabeth, for a much longer period, her policies, first of all, she was completely incompetent in Ireland. She may have been a good monarch in England, and you can say she was, but she basically ignored Ireland whenever, like, but she wouldn't, for example, the Earl of Ormond, he could have been Lord Deputy of Ireland. James of Scotland, before he became King of England, he brought, he allowed some of the Gaelic lords, especially, what's his name, Argyll Campbell, to become lords of Scotland as such, to become part of the state. Elizabeth didn't do that. There was a half-arsed attempt to surrender under Grant, but, for example, the Earl of Tyrone, Hugh O'Neill, he was made Earl of Tyrone, but there was never an attempt. He was never offered a position such as Lord President of Ulster. He was never offered a position on the council in Dublin. Whereas Bagnall, whose father came to Ireland, I think he murdered someone or robbed someone in England, came to Ireland, Novo Heash, building up his own lordship. Bagnall became Marshal and on the council, and his son inherited that. Hugh O'Neill was an English earl, but he wasn't on the council. Bagnall, who was supposedly his social inferior, was given power. So, and Elizabeth, her Irish policy too often just came down to the sword, to killing people. So, and then letting them starve, no problem. Just get rid of the Gaelic people. She had no time for them. She had no time, despite the myth of the Merry Monarch, Gloriana, she had a great fear of the great mass of people. She didn't like common people. She wanted to keep away from them. And like all autocrats, she often blamed the messenger and had no problems about large numbers of people being executed. So she was much worse than Cromwell. Okay, did someone else ask a question? Boan, Lizzie, yeah, you're agreeing with me there. Oh, thanks for that final comment, Michael. Yes, I must say that. So could everyone hit the like button? And if you want to, please subscribe. I'm going to start ending up now because I have to go back to work. I have revision to do. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope there was no problems with sound or anything. Sort of from the questions, I don't think there was. And I'm going to try and do one early next week, and then maybe the week after, no, because I'll be away. But I want to make this into something regular. So if you have any questions, you can send them to me on my YouTube channel. I've just got a message from YouTube the last few days about setting up your community, but I have to use a mobile phone to do that. So I'll have a look at that. But thanks for watching. Thanks for the contribution, Michael. And I hope you enjoyed this. And hopefully I'll see you next week. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Thanks a lot. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Thanks, Dennis. Oh, great. Thank you very much for telling me that. So hopefully I'll see you next week. And hopefully here in Ireland, the sun will continue to shine. It's in my eyes at the moment. The blind is down. I'm looking at the sun slowly going down. We've had a very, very wet summer. Third wet summer in a row. So we need some sun. And schools are going back. So hopefully September will be nice. Tá fáilte wrote, Bowen. Glad you liked it. And so I will say slán and good night. Ihoa. Good night to everybody. Have a nice week. Thanks for watching, and if you can, subscribe and share my videos, it would be great. Thanks a million. Bye bye. Slán.